Hi, Jeremy here again.
Mike here again. We're going to talk about Kolb's learning cycle, and just a reminder of where we've been. We talked about the goals for my particular course, and it illustrated that at least my tendency, and I think it's a similar tendency in instructors, is to dive right into content. And that when we talked a little bit more about the class, we realized there were things that were more important to us than content. It was a means to an end in many cases.
Yeah. So we're going to introduce Kolb's learning cycle as we use it. Now, it's important to say that Kolb's learning cycle is a constructivist learning theory, and it purports to explain how people actually learn. We sort of leave that part alone, and we adapt it as a model for designing instruction. And we do that primarily because it gives us two things. One, it presents a way for us to order things. So it gives us a way to move from one chunk of content or activity to another. The other thing is it gives us a complete model so that we don't leave anything out in terms of a student experience that's rich and engaging.
And obviously, learning is more complex than we've diagrammed here, but it is a useful, very useful design tool. And so let's go ahead and start talking about it. It has 4 parts, and Kolb would say that it starts with a concrete experience. All right, he was a constructivist, so he's going to start here.
Yeah.
And I think, the best type of experiences are those that leave the students a little bit perplexed.
Okay.
That maybe they, through this experience, realize that the knowledge structure that they had in place, the things that they know, can't adequately explain this new experience.
So what might be an example of this? I mean, does it have to be like a field trip or something? They take a bus across town and
It could
get
be
lost or what?
Yeah, it could be.
Okay.
It could be, an ill-structured experience. It could be a lab experience, but it could also be a story. It doesn't have to be a direct experience. They could be experiencing something vicariously through a character in a story.
Cool. Okay. So what I'm going to do is just write up a verb here that, to me, and you tell me if this sounds right, reflects what the students are actually doing. So I know this is kind of a little redundant, but the students are experiencing something. They're not necessarily ingesting information that they'll be tested on later or some content that they'll have to really held accountable for. It's more that they're having experience.
Right. I mean, there could be some content that slips in, but that's not the main purpose. It's really to leave them motivated to learn the new content or a little bit confused.
Cool.
Right. So the next step is reflective observation. And what this really means is that you've had this experience. It might have been a little bit unsettling. You may need some time to think about, how does this relate to what I already know and what I've already experienced, and what do I need to know in order to make sense of this experience that I just had. This may have to happen alone. And what I like about Kolb's learning cycle is this something I tend to not leave enough time for this, and it's just a really simple reminder to think about how I structure that.
Right. A little more processing, right?
Right.
So, yeah, it helps them kind of retain some of it and maybe begin to have some questions that will come in later.
Right.
Okay. The word that comes to mind is examining. Does that sound good?
That sounds great. Yeah.
Okay, so the student is going to be examining their experience here. Great.
Right. So below the box is just describing, what the student is doing during each of these phases. So the next one is abstract conceptualization. And this is where the students, with the help of the instructor and each other, are trying to generalize this experience. What sense can I make of this experience? What do I need to know? A lot of times they're going to need the instructor's help. If you're walking by a classroom at this stage of the learning cycle, it may look like a traditional class.
Yeah.
The students would be discussing, or the instructor might be explaining something on the board. But the goal here is to generalize what you've learned so that you can apply it in new situations.
Okay. So, for instance, if there's a body of literature in the discipline about this very experience and the topic at hand, that might be a time to bring that in, right? So the lecture could include that traditional kind of content or readings or whatever. Okay, good. So I think the word I'm going to try to put in here is explaining. So students are, I guess, both being explained to, but they're also in the process of explaining their experience to themselves now that they've had some of the context of the more general concepts.
Right.
Okay.
They're working through it. And, in my example of color theory, it might be here. I'm lecturing on what hue and color value and saturation are
Right.
at this point.
Right, and that might help explain what happened when they looked at that map and got snookered, as you said.
Right,
Okay,
right.
cool. Good.
Great. So the last step, I kind of alluded to this before, is active experimentation.
Okay.
And this is where the students take what they've generalized in this phase of the learning cycle, and they say, okay, does this hold up to a new situation
Yeah.
where it might be a little bit different than the original experience
Okay.
that we had? So this is, they're applying what they've learned.
Wow, right. So they're taking all this stuff sort of back out into the field almost. I mean, it might happen in the classroom, it might happen at home
Right.
with a laptop or something.
Right, right.
But they're really starting to apply. I think that's the word that sounds like it fits what is happening here, is they're applying what they've gotten so far. And of course, they're also, in a sense, closing the circle, right, as they move back towards where they started with their experience.
Yeah, and this new application phase could say that the generalization we came up with in this phase, it needs a little work, right? And so you spin off a new cycle.
Right, right.
And there's literature on using the Kolb's learning cycle as a design tool. In some of the papers, they suggest that you can hop into this learning cycle anywhere, but I really feel like this is the place to start if you really subscribe to a constructivist theory of learning.
Yeah.
And the nice thing about it is it's a reminder. I think my tendency in the last video was I got to explain concepts,
Sure.
terms, all that kind of stuff. We tend to jump in here into the learning cycle and don't draw enough on student experience to make that phase more interesting and understandable.
Right. No, and you mentioned this is an easy one to leave out too.
Mm-hmm.
You sort of just assume this will happen, but it's nice to prompt students to do this.
Yeah.
And give them a little more time to ingest and process. Yeah. All right. So there's a couple things I was going to ask. How do you think about this in terms of scale or time-wise? I mean, is this something that would happen in a day, or over a week, or over a whole semester, or what?
I think any of those. This could describe a day in your classroom. This could all happen in class. This could also, these two things could happen before class, and this could happen in class. Sure. I think it's flexible, and in my mind, I'm thinking of a bunch of eddies, a bunch of cycles within cycles. This could even describe, the structure, the big structure of an entire course, which is the nice thing about this, is that it applies across scales, I think.
Right, and you can repeat it too. Like you said, if something isn't totally finished when you move on to a next section, it drives people back to the earlier parts.
Right.
Yeah, cool. Excellent. Sounds good. Well, in the next video, we'll take a look at how this applies to your course, and we'll look at a very fleshed out example of its application.
Great.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks.